Some wounds never heal, they just teach us how to live with the pain. When 58-year-old mountain man Nathaniel Brennan returns to the dying town of Copper Ridge after 20 years alone in the wilderness, he finds a young woman named Grace Holloway abandoned behind the saloon in her wedding dress. The minister's son left her at the altar with nothing but shame and broken promises. What happens next changes everything. Nate drags her to his cabin in the mountains, but this isn't what it seems. Two broken people, both betrayed by life, find themselves thrown together in the harsh frontier. She's lost everything on what should have been the happiest day of her life. He spent decades running from his own ghosts. What starts as survival becomes something deeper. Can two souls damaged by betrayal find redemption in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and broken dreams through the skeletal remains of Copper Ridge. Once, this town had pulsed with the heartbeat of ambition, miners flooding in with dirt under their fingernails and silver fever. In their eyes, merchants hawking everything from pickaxes to hope, women in colorful dresses laughing from saloon doorways. Now 20 years after the last profitable vein ran dry, Copper Ridge clung to existence like an old man refusing to admit his time had passed. Nathaniel Brennan stood at the edge of what used to be Main Street, his weathered hands resting on the reins of his pack mule. At 58, he carried himself with the careful economy of movement that marked men who had learned to survive alone. His beard, streaked with silver, framed a face that had been handsome once, before war and disappointment, carved deep lines around his eyes. The buckskin jacket he wore had seen better decades, patched and repatched until it told the story of a man who made do with what he had. 20 years. 20 years since he'd walked away from this place, from civilization itself, carrying nothing but his shame and a heart full of thorns. The town looked smaller now, diminished, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Half the buildings stood empty, their windows dark as dead eyes. The Methodist church still stood, its white paint peeling like old skin, and Murphy's saloon kept its doors open for the stubborn few who refused to let the town die completely. Nathaniel's mule snorted, impatient to be moving again. The animal had grown accustomed to the solitude of mountain trails, just as its owner had. For 2 decades, Nathaniel had made his home in a cabin carved from the wilderness itself, living off what the land provided, trading his handiwork in distant settlements for supplies. He'd become something of a legend in those remote places. The mountain man who could track a deer through rock, who could read weather in the way shadows fell, who spoke to animals with more ease than he did to people. But legends, like all men, grew old. And old men, even legends, sometimes found themselves drawn back to the places that had broken them, if only to see whether the breaking had been permanent. Hidden in his saddlebags, wrapped in oiled cloth beneath his spare ammunition and winter provisions, lay a tarnished medal from the war between the states. Colonel Nathaniel Brennan, it read, for distinguished service at Antietam. He'd been 25 then, young enough to believe that courage could solve any problem, that honor was worth dying for. The medal had been given to him by a general, whose name he could no longer remember, in a ceremony that felt like something from another man's life. That younger Nathaniel had returned from war, expecting to slide back into the world like a sword returning to its sheath. Instead, he'd found himself a stranger in his own skin. The sounds of normal life, children playing, church bells ringing, women humming as they hung laundry, seemed to come from somewhere far away. His wife, sweet Margaret, with her cornflower eyes and patient smile, had tried to understand. She'd held him when the nightmares came, listened when he needed to talk about things that had no business in a proper home. But understanding and enduring are different creatures entirely. When their son came, little Thomas, born with Nathaniel's stubborn chin and Margaret's gentle nature, hope had flickered to life again. For 3 perfect months, Nathaniel had believed the war might finally release its grip on him. He'd held his son in calloused hands and whispered promises about the man the boy would become, the life they'd build together. Then, the fever came. Nathaniel pushed the memory away with practiced efficiency, the way a man learns to step around broken glass. Some wounds never healed, they just learned to stay quiet most of the time. The sound of laughter drew his attention back to the present. Genuine laughter, bright and unexpected in this graveyard of a town. It came from Murphy's saloon, where a small crowd had gathered. Nathaniel guided his mule closer, more from habit than curiosity. In the mountains, you learn to investigate anything unusual because unusual often meant dangerous. Through the saloon's grimy windows, he could see the source of the commotion. A young woman, perhaps 22 or 23, stood in the center of the barroom wearing a wedding dress that had seen better hours. The white satin was torn at the hem and stained with mud, the delicate beadwork catching the lamplight like stars reflected in a dirty stream. Her dark hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, falling in waves around her shoulders. She was speaking to the gathered men with animated gestures, and even through the glass, Nathaniel could see the bright fever of desperation in her eyes. Grace Holloway, though Nathaniel didn't know her name yet, had been raised in the Methodist orphanage until she was 16. Her parents had died in a wagon accident when she was 5, leaving her with nothing but a worn leather Bible and the vague memory of her mother singing lullabies. The church had done its duty by her, teaching her to read and write, to sew and cook, to keep her thoughts proper and her ankles covered. But charity, however well-intentioned, leaves marks on a person's soul. Grace had learned early to be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness came her way, to make herself useful, to never ask for more than was offered. When Reverend Morrison's son Henry had begun paying her attention, the whole town had nodded with satisfaction. Henry was 26, well-educated, destined to take over his father's ministry when the old man retired. Grace was pretty enough, obedient, and desperately grateful for the chance to finally belong somewhere permanent. It seemed like a match, made in heaven, or at least in the practical minds of people who understood that love was a luxury poor girls couldn't afford. The wedding had been planned for months. Grace had sewn her own dress, working by candlelight to save oil, her fingers bleeding from countless pinpricks. She'd made the cake herself, practiced her vows until she could recite them without her voice shaking, scrubbed the church until every pew gleamed like new hope. This morning, she'd stood at the altar in that hand-sewn dress, bouquet trembling in her hands, watching the door for her bridegroom. The guests had grown restless first, then concerned, then embarrassed. Reverend Morrison had sent men to look for his son, his face growing redder with each passing minute. When they'd finally found Henry, he'd been 2 counties away, riding hard for the railroad with his bags packed and a ticket to San Francisco in his pocket. The note he'd left was brief. "I cannot live the life my father has planned for me. Find someone else to be your perfect minister's wife." Grace had stood there in her ruined dress, holding her wilted bouquet, while whispers rose around her like steam. Poor girl. What did she expect? Always putting on airs above her station. Better she learns now than later. The practical cruelty of small-town wisdom, delivered in voices that pretended to be kind. Now, hours later, she was still in that dress, still carrying the ghost of hope in her eyes as she tried to convince the saloon patrons that she had somewhere to go, someone who would take her in. But Copper Ridge was a dying town full of dying dreams, and charity was a luxury nobody could afford. Nathaniel watched through the window as the laughter died away and the men began to drift back to their drinks. The young woman's voice grew, higher, more desperate, as her audience evaporated. He could read the signs as clearly as he could read weather. She was about to break, the way green wood breaks under too much pressure. He should ride on. This was none of his business, and he'd learned long ago that getting involved in other people's troubles was a sure way to acquire troubles of your own. He had supplies to replenish, winter preparations to make. The mountains didn't care about abandoned brides or broken promises, but something in the set of her shoulders, the way she lifted her chin against defeat, reminded him of another young person who'd once faced the world with nothing but courage and stubbornness. Reminded him of the son he'd lost, grown to adulthood in imagination only. Margaret had blamed him for Thomas's death, not directly, never in so many words, but in the way she'd stopped meeting his eyes, stopped reaching for his hand in the dark, as if his war-stained soul had somehow poisoned their perfect child, as if love, no matter how fierce, couldn't survive the weight of too much sorrow. She'd been right, of course. That was the hell of it. The young woman stumbled as she left the saloon, catching herself against the doorframe. Nathaniel could see her face clearly now in the fading afternoon light. Pretty, but more than that, intelligent. The kind of face that belonged to someone who read books, who thought about things beyond her immediate circumstances. The kind of face that didn't deserve what the world had handed her today. She looked around the empty street with the lost expression of someone who'd just realized they were completely alone. Her wedding dress, ridiculous and heartbreaking in equal measure, caught the wind and billowed around her like a white flag of surrender. Nathaniel made a decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. He dismounted, tied his mule to the hitching post, and walked toward the girl who had nowhere to go. Grace heard the heavy footsteps behind her before she saw the man. She turned, still clutching the folds of her torn wedding dress, and found herself looking up at someone who seemed carved from the mountains themselves. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they could break bones or gentle a frightened animal with equal ease. His eyes were the color of winter sky, sharp and assessing, but not unkind. "Miss," he said, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone who didn't waste words on pleasantries. "You got somewhere to go tonight?" The question was simple, but it cut straight through all her pretense. Grace felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crumble. She'd been holding herself together through sheer will for the past 6 hours, telling herself that she was fine, that she could figure something out. But this stranger's direct question forced her to confront the truth she'd been avoiding. She stopped, swallowed hard. "I'm sure something will work out." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, taking in the mud stains on her dress, the way her hands shook, despite her attempts to appear composed. He'd seen enough desperate people in his time to recognize the signs. This girl was maybe 2 hours away from complete breakdown, and the October night was already carrying the bite of coming winter. "Name's Nathaniel Brennan," he said. "Most folks call me Nate. And you?" "Grace Holloway." The name felt strange on her lips now, as if it belonged to someone else. The Grace Holloway who'd woken up this morning had been a bride-to-be, full of nervous excitement and careful plans. This Grace Holloway was something else entirely, a woman with no prospects and nowhere to go. "Well, Miss Holloway, I got a cabin up in the mountains. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. You're welcome to shelter there until you figure out. What comes next?" Grace stared at him. In her sheltered life, she'd been warned about men who offered help to desperate women, about the prices that such help usually carried. But this man's offer was delivered with the same straightforward honesty as a weather report. No hint of threat, no suggestion of payment expected. "I don't have any money," she said quietly. "Didn't ask for money. I'm not..." She felt heat rise in her cheeks, unsure how to express her concerns without seeming ungrateful. Nathaniel understood. "Miss, I'm 58 years old, and I've been living alone in those mountains for 20 years. If I wanted female company of that nature, I'd have found it a long time ago. I'm offering you a place to sleep and maybe some hot food, nothing more, nothing less." Grace studied his face, searching for deception and finding none. Behind her, she could hear the sounds from the saloon growing louder as evening approached. Soon the men inside would be drunk enough to start making their own offers, and those offers wouldn't come with the same respectful distance this mountain man was maintaining. Her hand moved unconsciously to the small leather Bible tucked inside. Her dress, her mother's Bible, the only thing she had left of her family. The worn pages contained pressed flowers from her mother's garden, along with margin notes written in her father's careful script. It was her most precious possession, and right now it felt like her only anchor to who she used to be. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you." Nathaniel nodded once, as if her acceptance was a foregone conclusion. "Can you ride?" Grace looked at his mule with uncertainty. "Not very well." "You'll learn." He untied the animal and helped Grace climb awkwardly onto its back, her wedding dress proving as impractical for riding as it was for everything else. Nathaniel took the reins and began leading them away from town, his long strides covering ground with efficient purpose. As Copper Ridge fell behind them, Grace felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. She was leaving behind everything familiar, following a stranger into the wilderness. But the familiar world had just finished teaching her exactly how much it valued her, so perhaps the unknown couldn't be worse. The trail began to climb almost. Immediately, winding through stands of aspen and pine that seemed to close in around them as darkness fell. Nathaniel moved with the confidence of someone who could find his way home blind, never hesitating at the various forks and game trails that branched off from the main path. "How far?" Grace asked, trying to keep her voice steady as they climbed higher into the mountains. "Few more miles." Nathaniel glanced back at her. "You holding up all right?" "I'm fine." It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that kept a person moving forward. Grace was discovering reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps it was simply that she'd reached the point where there was no choice but to keep going. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was smaller than Grace had expected, but well-built and welcoming. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, suggesting that Nathaniel had banked his fire carefully before leaving that morning. A small barn stood nearby, along with what looked like a vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for the winter. Nathaniel helped her down from the mule with the same matter-of-fact courtesy he'd shown throughout their journey. "Go on inside," he said. "I'll tend to the animals and be along directly." Grace pushed open the cabin door and stepped into warmth. The single room was spartanly furnished but clean, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a bed built. Into one corner, shelves lined one wall, holding supplies and a few precious books. The whole place smelled of wood smoke and leather and something else, something that spoke of a life lived simply but deliberately. She sank into the single wooden chair, suddenly exhausted. The events of the day crashed over her like a delayed storm, and she found herself shaking uncontrollably. This morning she'd been someone with a future, someone with plans and dreams and a place in the world. Now she was a charity case in a mountain man's cabin, wearing a wedding dress that had become a costume for a play that would never be performed. When Nathaniel came inside a few minutes later, he found her crying quietly into her hands. He stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain. He knew how to set a broken bone, how to calm a spooked horse, how to survive in conditions that would kill most men, but he had no idea what to do with a young woman's tears. "Miss Holloway," he began. "Grace," she said, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Just Grace. I don't think I'm Miss Holloway anymore. I don't know what I am." Nathaniel hung his hat on a peg by the door and moved to the fireplace, adding wood to the coals with practiced efficiency. "You're someone who got dealt a bad hand today," he said finally. "Doesn't change who you are underneath." Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the dust on her cheeks. "You don't understand. I have nothing. No home, no family, no money, no prospects. I'm completely alone." "Alone isn't the same as finished," Nathaniel said, his voice gentle but firm. "I've been alone for 20 years. Doesn't mean I'm not still here." Something in his tone made Grace look at him more carefully. There was pain in his winter-colored eyes, old and deep and carefully managed. This man understood something about being alone, about having to rebuild yourself from broken pieces. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded, still tending the fire. "Why did you help me? You don't know me. I could be anyone." Nathaniel was quiet for so long that Grace thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his words came. Slowly, as if he was discovering them as he said them. "Had a son once," he said. "Would have been about your age now if he'd lived. I'd like to think that if he'd ever needed help, someone would have offered it." The simple honesty of his answer made Grace's throat tight with emotion. She understood suddenly that this gruff mountain man was offering her more than shelter. He was offering her a chance to matter to someone, even if only temporarily. Outside, the October wind howled through the peaks, carrying the promise of winter's approach. Inside the small cabin, two damaged souls sat in comfortable silence, both of them beginning to realize that sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms. Grace woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood. For a moment, she lay still in the narrow bed, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Pale morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, and she could hear Nathaniel moving around outside with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been awake for hours. She'd slept in her wedding dress, too exhausted and overwhelmed to think about changing. Now the once beautiful gown was hopelessly wrinkled and stained, a monument to broken dreams. Grace sat up slowly, running her fingers through her tangled hair. Her whole body ached from the previous day's events and the uncomfortable night on the unfamiliar bed. The cabin door opened, and Nathaniel entered carrying an armload of firewood. He glanced at her briefly, nodded a greeting, and began building up the fire. His movements were economical and purposeful, wasting no motion or energy. Grace watched him work, noting the way his hands, scarred and calloused from decades of hard labor, handled even routine tasks with careful precision. "Coffee's on the stove," he said without looking at her. "Nothing fancy, but it's hot." Grace stood up, smoothing down her ruined dress as much as possible. The coffee was bitter and strong, the kind of brew designed to wake a person up rather than please their palate, but it was warm, and warmth felt like luxury in the mountain morning. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her fingers around the tin cup, "for everything. I know you didn't have to—" "Don't!" Nathaniel interrupted, finally meeting her eyes. "Don't start every day with gratitude for basic human decency. Makes a man feel like a saint just for not being a complete bastard." Despite everything, Grace almost smiled. There was something refreshing about his bluntness after years of careful church politeness and social niceties. "I need to ask you something," Nathaniel continued, settling into the other chair with his own cup of coffee. "What are your plans? I mean, long-term. You can't stay here forever, and winter's coming fast in these mountains." The question Grace had been dreading. She stared into her coffee cup, trying to find an answer that didn't sound as hopeless as she felt. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose I could find work somewhere. As a seamstress, maybe, or a cook. I'm good with my hands." "Closest town of any size is 3 days' ride," Nathaniel said matter-of-factly, "and most places aren't looking to hire single women with no references or family connections." The harsh reality of her situation settled over Grace like a cold blanket. She'd been raised to be a minister's wife, trained in all the proper accomplishments of a respectable woman. But respectability required a social structure that would accept her, and that structure had just collapsed. Nathaniel studied her face, reading the despair she was trying to hide. After 20 years of solitude, he'd almost forgotten what it was like to worry about another person's welfare. The sensation was uncomfortable, like wearing boots that no longer fit properly. "Tell you what," he said finally, "winter's hard up here and I could use some help getting ready for it. You stay through the snow season, help with the cooking and preserving and such, and come spring, I'll take you wherever you want to go, give you enough supplies to get started fresh." Grace looked up at him, hope flickering in her eyes. "You do that? Seems fair. You work, I provide food and shelter, not charity, partnership." The word partnership did something to Grace's wounded pride. It suggested she had value to offer, that she wasn't just an object of pity. What kind of work? Over the next hour, Nathaniel outlined the realities of mountain life. There was firewood to cut and stack, vegetables to harvest and preserve, meat to smoke, repairs to make before the harsh weather arrived. It was hard, practical work, the kind that left no room for delicate sensibilities. Grace listened with growing determination. She might not know anything about frontier survival, but she knew about hard work. The orphanage had taught her that much, even if it hadn't prepared her for heartbreak. "I'll need different clothes," she said, looking down at her impractical wedding dress. Nathaniel nodded toward a wooden chest in the corner. "Belong to my wife. Might be a bit large, but better than what you've got on." The simple statement carried weight that Grace was only beginning to understand. This man had been married once, had lost everything just as she had. The knowledge created an unexpected bond between them. They were both survivors of dreams that hadn't worked out. The clothes in the chest were well made but simple: wool skirts, cotton blouses, sturdy boots that had been resoled more than once. As Grace held up a dark blue dress, she caught a faint scent of lavender and sadness. Another woman had worn these clothes, had folded them carefully away, never knowing they would someday outfit a stranger. Her name was Margaret. "Nathaniel," said quietly, noticing Grace's hesitation. "She's been gone 15 years. No point in letting good clothes go to waste." Grace nodded, understanding that this was another gift, the sharing of a name, a small piece of his history. "I'll take good care of them." When she emerged from behind the blanket he'd hung for privacy, Grace felt different. The practical clothes transformed her from abandoned bride to working woman. The boots were too large, but wool stockings helped with the fit. The dress was loose in some places and tight in others, but it was clean and warm and infinitely more suitable than white satin. Nathaniel looked at her appraisingly, the way he might evaluate a new horse or a piece of equipment. "Better," he said with approval. "Now let's see if you can learn to split kindling without taking off a finger." The next few hours were a revelation. Grace had never realized how much skill was required for the simplest tasks of survival. Splitting wood required a specific technique and rhythm that her soft hands and inexperienced muscles couldn't master immediately. Her first attempts sent kindling flying in all directions, earning a grunt of amusement from Nathaniel. "Here," he said, moving behind her to correct her grip on the axe. His hands covered hers, guiding her movements. "Feel the weight of the blade. Don't fight it. Let it do the work." Grace was acutely aware of his presence, the solid warmth of him at her back, the patient way he adjusted her stance. There was nothing improper in his touch, nothing that wouldn't be acceptable in front of the church congregation. But there was an intimacy in the shared task, in the way he took time to teach her properly rather than simply doing the work himself. Gradually, she began to find the rhythm, not expertly, but well enough to produce usable kindling. When she finally split a piece cleanly in two, Nathaniel nodded with what might have been satisfaction. "You'll do," he said simply. Those two words meant more to Grace than any elaborate compliment ever had. They suggested she had value, that she could contribute something useful to this strange partnership they were building. As the day wore on, Grace discovered muscles she'd forgotten she had. Her hands developed blisters, her back ached, and her carefully maintained fingernails broke one by one. But with each small task completed, kindling split, vegetables harvested, meat carried from the smokehouse, she felt a growing sense of competence. That evening, as they sat by the fire eating a simple meal of venison and potatoes, Grace realized she hadn't thought about Henry Morrison or her ruined wedding in several hours. The work had given her something she'd been missing, purpose that didn't depend on someone else's approval. Outside, the mountain wind carried the promise of winter's approach. Inside the small cabin, two people who'd been strangers 24 hours earlier sat in comfortable silence, both of them beginning to discover that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships were also the most necessary ones. 3 weeks into their unlikely partnership, Grace woke before dawn with a familiar queasy feeling that made her stomach lurch and her mouth water in all the wrong ways. She lay still in the darkness, hoping the sensation would pass, but instead it grew stronger. She barely made it outside before losing what little remained of last night's supper. When she finally straightened up, wiping her mouth with a shaking hand, she found Nathaniel standing in the cabin doorway. The early morning light caught the concern in his expression, though his voice remained carefully neutral. "You feeling poorly?" Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The nausea was beginning to subside, but it left her feeling hollow and weak. "How long?" Nathaniel asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. Grace understood what he was really asking, and the knowledge settled over her like a weight she'd been trying not to acknowledge. She'd missed her monthly courses, had been feeling tired and emotional beyond what their situation warranted. The signs had been there, but she'd been too overwhelmed by everything else to pay attention. "I think—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "I think I might be carrying Henry's child." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Grace braced herself for judgment, for the kind of moral lecture she'd grown up hearing, about fallen women and their just consequences. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "We'd better get some food into you. Baby needs nutrition, whether you're feeling up to eating or not." His matter-of-fact acceptance of her condition nearly brought Grace to tears. After weeks of careful politeness and formal distance, this crisis had stripped away their mutual caution and revealed something deeper: genuine care between two people who'd learned to trust each other. Over breakfast, weak tea, and dry biscuits that were all Grace could manage. They discussed the practical implications of her pregnancy. Winter was approaching fast, and the nearest doctor was 3 days away on good roads. If complications arose, Grace would be entirely dependent on Nathaniel's limited medical knowledge and whatever supplies they had on hand. "My mother died birthing me," Grace said quietly, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest. "The church ladies always said it ran in families, difficult births." Nathaniel reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. The gesture was brief but warm, the first deliberate physical comfort he'd offered since her arrival. "My Margaret had trouble too," he said, "but that doesn't mean you will. Every woman's different, every birth its own story." The mention of his wife sparked Grace's curiosity. In their weeks together, Nathaniel had shared very little about his past beyond the basic facts. She knew he'd been married, knew he'd lost a son, knew he'd fought in the war. But the details remained locked away behind his careful reserve. "Will you tell me about them?" she asked. "Your wife and son?" Nathaniel was quiet for so long that Grace thought he was going to refuse. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was pulling them from someplace deep and carefully guarded. "Margaret was 19 when we married, pretty as spring morning, with yellow hair and the kindest heart you ever saw. She wanted children, something fierce, used to practice. Their names, plan out their futures before they were even conceived." He paused, staring into his coffee cup. "Thomas came along 3 years into our marriage, perfect little boy, healthy as could be. Margaret was so proud, carrying him around town like he was made of spun gold. For about 3 months, we had everything we dreamed of." Grace waited, sensing the painful turn the story was about to take. "Fever took him," Nathaniel continued. "Same one that took half the children in the county that year. Nothing we could do but watch him waste away. Margaret never forgave herself, thought she should have been able to protect him somehow. I never forgave myself either, if I'm being honest." "It wasn't your fault," Grace said softly, knowing something. "And feeling it are different creatures," Nathaniel replied. "Margaret started pulling away after that, stopped talking much, stopped sleeping well. When I'd come back from hunting or working, I'd find her just sitting in the baby's room, staring at nothing. The war had already changed me some, made me harder to live with. Losing Thomas finished the job." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, imagining the grief that had torn apart his young marriage. What happened to her? She left, packed her things one day while I was out checking traps, and went to live with her sister in Missouri. Said she couldn't stand looking at me anymore because I reminded her too much of what we'd lost. Nathaniel's voice remained steady, but Grace could hear the old pain beneath the calm surface. Can't say I blamed her. I reminded myself of it too. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Grace absorbed this piece of Nathaniel's history, understanding now why he'd chosen 20 years of solitude over risking that kind of heartbreak again. Is that when you came to the mountains? Not right away. Tried to make it work in town for a while, but everywhere I looked, I saw families that looked like what mine should have been. Finally decided the mountains were easier to live with than people. Grace traced patterns on the wooden table with her finger, thinking about the terrible arithmetic of loss. Do you ever regret it, leaving civilization behind? Some days, Nathaniel admitted. But regret's just another luxury I learned to do without. As the weeks passed and Grace's pregnancy progressed, she began to notice changes in Nathaniel's behavior. He was more protective now, insisting she avoid the heavier tasks, watching her with careful attention for signs of fatigue or distress. When she caught him carving something by the firelight one evening, he tried to hide it, but she glimpsed enough to recognize the beginnings of a small wooden cross. "For the baby?" she asked. Nathaniel's hands stilled on his work. "Thought you might want something. For comfort, I mean." The simple gift touched Grace more than any expensive present ever could have. She realized that this gruff mountain man was trying, in his awkward way, to provide the emotional support she would need in the months ahead. "Thank you," she said. "It's beautiful." That night, as Grace lay in bed listening to Nathaniel's quiet, breathing from his bedroll by the fire, she found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. 6 weeks ago, she'd been planning a conventional marriage to a weak man who'd ultimately abandoned her. Now she was carrying his child while living with a damaged war veteran who showed her more genuine kindness than her intended husband ever had. The baby moved for the first time then, just a flutter, like butterfly wings against her ribs. Grace pressed her hands to her belly, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of the life growing inside her. This child would be born into unconventional circumstances, but it would be wanted. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps love, even the complicated kind she was beginning to feel for Nathaniel, was more important than respectability. Outside, the October wind howled through the peaks, carrying the promise of a hard winter ahead. But inside the warm cabin, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope for the future. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the mountains in pristine white that made the world look newly made. Grace stood at the cabin window, watching fat flakes drift past, her hand resting on her growing belly. At 4 months along, she could no longer hide her condition, even under the loose dresses from Margaret's trunk. The sound of horses approaching broke the morning silence. Nathaniel emerged from the barn where he'd been tending the animals, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle he kept nearby. Grace felt her stomach clench with more than morning sickness as she recognized the lead rider. Henry Morrison sat tall in his saddle, flanked by Sheriff Webb and 2 other men from town. Even from a distance, Grace could see the self-righteous set of his shoulders, the way he surveyed the cabin as if he owned everything in sight. Behind him rode Reverend Morrison, Henry's father, his face grim beneath his black hat. "Grace Holloway!" Henry called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been truly challenged. "Come out here this instant." Grace's hand went to her throat, where she could feel her pulse hammering. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she'd hoped for more time, more preparation. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, blocking her view of the riders. "You stay inside," he said quietly. "Let me handle this." But Grace had spent too many years being handled, being spoken for, being treated like a child who couldn't manage her own affairs. She moved past Nathaniel onto the porch, lifting her chin in defiance of her racing heart. "Henry," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I see you finally found your way back." Henry's face flushed at the implicit accusation. "I've come to take you home, Grace. This," he gestured broadly at the cabin, at Nathaniel, at the entire situation. "This madness has gone on long enough." "Home." Grace's voice carried a bitter edge she hadn't known she possessed. "Where exactly would that be? The house you abandoned me in front of? The church where you left me standing at the altar like a fool?" Sheriff Webb cleared his throat, uncomfortably. "Now, Miss Holloway, we're just here to make sure you're all right. Folks in town have been worried, what with you disappearing and all." "Worried," Grace repeated. "How thoughtful. Where was all this concern when I was left standing in my wedding dress with nowhere to go?" Reverend Morrison urged his horse forward, his weathered face set in lines of moral certainty. "Grace, child, you've been led astray by grief and poor judgment. This man," he nodded toward Nathaniel, "has taken advantage of your vulnerable state. It's not too late to correct this mistake." Nathaniel had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now he stepped forward, his presence somehow filling the space around him. "Mistake?" he said quietly. "The only mistake I see is a grown man who runs away from his responsibilities and then comes back expecting gratitude." Henry's hand moved to the pistol at his side. "You have no right to speak to me, old man. Grace is my intended wife, and I'll not have you—" "Your intended wife." Grace's voice cut through his bluster like a blade. "Is that what you call a woman? You abandoned at the altar? A woman you left with no money, no home, no prospects?" She stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "You forfeited any claim to me the moment you chose cowardice over commitment." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind in the pines and the restless movement of horses. Grace could feel Nathaniel behind her, solid and supportive, and it gave her the courage to continue. "You want to know if I'm all right, Sheriff Webb? I'm better than all right. For the first time in my life, I'm living with someone who keeps his word, who doesn't run away when things get difficult, who treats me like a partner instead of a possession." Henry's face had gone pale except for 2 spots of angry red on his cheekbones. "Grace, you don't understand what you're saying. You've been isolated up here, influenced by what? Kindness, respect, the novel experience of being valued. For something other than my ability to smile prettily and keep my mouth shut?" Grace felt years of suppressed anger bubbling up. "You're right, Henry. I have been influenced. I've learned what it feels like to be treated like a human being instead of a decorative object." Reverend Morrison's voice carried the weight of pulpit authority. "Grace, you're speaking from hurt and confusion, but consider your reputation, your place in the community, living here alone with this man in sin." "In sin?" Grace's voice rose. "What sin would that be, Reverend? The sin of survival? The sin of accepting help when your son left me with nothing? Or perhaps the sin of discovering that I'm worth more than whatever scraps of affection your family was willing to throw my way?" She moved her hand to her belly, where the baby's presence was just beginning to show. Several of the men followed the gesture, and she saw understanding dawn in their eyes. "You're carrying his child," Henry said, his voice flat with shock and revulsion. "I'm carrying your child," Grace replied steadily. "The child you created and then abandoned, just like you abandoned me." The admission hit the group like a physical blow. Sheriff Webb's horse sidled nervously, sensing the tension in its rider. Reverend Morrison's face went grey, and Henry looked as if he'd been struck. That's impossible," Henry stammered. We only—" "Once," Grace finished, "for him. 3 nights before our wedding, when you came to the house scared and needy, talking about your doubts and your fears. When I comforted you the way a good wife should, because I thought we were about to be married, because I thought you loved me." Her voice carried a bitter edge. "Apparently, I was wrong about that too." Nathaniel stepped closer to Grace, not touching her, but making his presence clearly felt. "Seems to me the boy's got a choice to make," he said quietly. "He can step up and take responsibility for his actions, or he can ride away again. But either way, he's not taking Grace anywhere she doesn't want to go." Henry's hand tightened on his reins, his knuckles white. "You can't be serious. Grace, you can't possibly want to stay here in the middle of nowhere with him." Grace looked at Henry for a long moment, really seeing him for the first time. The weak mouth, the shifting eyes, the way he sat his horse like someone playing at being a man rather than actually being one. Then she looked at Nathaniel, taking in his steady presence, his weathered strength, the way he'd stood beside her without trying to speak for her. "You're right," she said finally. "I can't possibly want that." She paused, savoring the moment. "I don't want it, I choose it. There's a difference." The distinction seemed to break something in Henry, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You'll regret this, Grace. When winter really hits, when you're cold and hungry and alone with a bastard child, you'll remember what you threw away." Nathaniel's voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet promise of violence. "Boy, you'd better think real careful about what you say next. Miss Grace has been nothing but patient with your foolishness, but my patience runs considerably shorter." There was something in Nathaniel's tone that made even Sheriff Webb shift uncomfortably in his saddle. This was not just a mountain hermit they were dealing with. There was something harder underneath, something that had seen real violence and was prepared to see it again if necessary. Reverend Morrison recognized the danger and took control of the situation. "Henry, we've said what we came to say. The choice is Miss Holloway's to make." He looked directly at Grace, his eyes sad but not unkind. "I pray you'll reconsider, child. But if this is truly your decision, then may God watch over you." As the riders turned to leave, Henry called back over his shoulder, "Don't come crawling back when he gets tired of playing house with you, Grace. There won't be anything left for you in town." Grace watched them ride away until they disappeared into the falling snow. Only then did she allow herself to sag slightly, the confrontation having taken more out of her than she'd realized. "You all right?" Nathaniel asked quietly. Grace turned to him, seeing the concern in his winter-colored eyes, the way he'd positioned himself to shield her from whatever came next. "I'm better than all right," she said, meaning it. "I'm free." The November wind carried more than snow. It brought news from town, delivered by Murphy, the saloon keeper who made monthly trips to the mountain settlements to trade whiskey for pelts and gossip. He arrived on a gray afternoon when the first real blizzard was building on the horizon, his pack mule loaded with supplies and his weathered face grim with purpose. "Nate," he called out as he approached the cabin, "got some things you need to know." Nathaniel emerged from the woodshed where he'd been splitting logs, Grace beside him despite his repeated suggestions that she should stay warm inside. At 6 months pregnant, she moved more carefully now, but her determination to be part of whatever was happening hadn't diminished. Murphy dismounted stiffly, his joints protesting the cold ride. He was a man in his 60s, worn thin by hard living, but shrewd enough to have survived when tougher men had failed. His eyes took in Grace's condition without comment. In his line of work, he'd learned that judgment was a luxury he couldn't afford. "What's the word from town, Murphy?" Nathaniel asked, helping the older man unsaddle his mule. "Henry Morrison's been making noise," Murphy replied, accepting the cup of coffee Grace brought him. "Talking to anyone who'll listen about how you stole his woman, how you're keeping her up here against her will." He paused to take a long sip of the hot brew. "Most folks remember what actually happened, but some are starting to listen." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. "What kind of noise?" Murphy looked uncomfortable. "He's been saying things about the baby, claiming it's yours, Nate, not his. Says Grace was carrying on with you even before the wedding. That's why he had to call it off." The lie was so brazen, so completely contrary to the truth, that Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. Nathaniel's face went very still, the way she'd learned it did when he was controlling his temper. "Anyone believing that nonsense?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "Some are," Murphy admitted. "Folks like a good scandal, especially when it involves someone they can look down on. And Grace, no offense intended, but you never quite fit in with the town ladies. Too smart, too independent. They're ready enough to believe the worst." Grace sank into her chair, one hand moving protectively to her belly. The baby kicked in response to her agitation, as if sensing the threat to their precarious safety. "What are they saying exactly?" Murphy's expression grew even more uncomfortable. "They're saying you were a loose woman who played the innocent to trap a preacher's son. And when that didn't work, you took up with the mountain man. Some are even suggesting—" He stopped, clearly reluctant to continue. "Say it." Nathaniel's voice carried a warning edge. "Some are suggesting that Grace should be brought back to town for her own good, for the good of the baby, that a pregnant woman shouldn't be left alone in the mountains with—" Murphy's voice trailed off. "With what?" Grace demanded. "With a man who's been living like an animal for 20 years. Murphy finished reluctantly. "Henry's been telling stories about how you've gone half wild, Nate, how the war damaged you, how you can't be trusted around decent women." Nathaniel was very quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. Grace could see the old pain in his eyes, the wounds that had never quite healed. She realized suddenly that Henry's lies weren't just attacks on her reputation. They were calculated strikes at Nathaniel's deepest insecurities. "There's more," Murphy continued, clearly wishing he didn't have to deliver the rest of his news. "Sheriff Webb's been asking questions about your legal status, Nate. Whether you actually own this land, whether you've been paying taxes. Henry's father has some influence with the territorial government." Grace felt the walls of their small sanctuary closing in. "What does that mean?" "It means they might have ways to force you off this land if they really want to," Murphy replied. "And if you resist, well, that could give them excuse to use force." The three of them sat in silence, absorbing the implications. Outside, the wind was picking up, driving snow against the cabin windows with increasing violence. The storm that was coming would cut them off from the outside world for weeks, maybe months. But when spring came, they might find their enemies. Had spent the winter preparing for war. "Why are you telling us this, Murphy?" Nathaniel asked finally. "What's in it for you?" The older man smiled sadly. "Maybe I'm getting soft in my old age. Maybe I remember what it was like to be judged by folks who never had to make the hard choices." He looked directly at Grace. "Or maybe I can see that you found something real here, something worth protecting." That evening, after Murphy had taken shelter in the barn for the night, Grace and Nathaniel sat by the fire, both lost in their own thoughts. The baby was active, responding to Grace's anxiety with constant movement that made sleep impossible. "Nathaniel," Grace said finally, breaking the heavy silence, "there's something I need to tell you." He looked up from the piece of wood he'd been carving. Another toy for the baby, she realized. Another sign of his growing investment in their future. About what Murphy said. About people thinking this baby is yours instead of Henry's. Grace took a shaky breath. "Part of me wishes it were true." Nathaniel's hands stilled on his carving. "Grace, I know it's wrong," she continued quickly. "I know it's sinful to wish away the truth, but this baby feels more yours than his. You're the one who's cared for us, protected us, made us feel wanted. You're the one who stays." For a long moment, Nathaniel didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I've been pretending too," he admitted. "When I'm making cradle or thinking about teaching the child to hunt or read, I forget sometimes that it's not really mine. I forget that come spring, you might decide to leave to find a proper father for your baby." Grace stood up slowly, moving to where he sat. With careful deliberation, she reached up and touched the chain around his neck, the one that still held his ex-wife's wedding ring, the one physical reminder of his failed marriage that he hadn't been able to abandon. "May I?" she asked softly. Nathaniel nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. Grace lifted the chain over his head, feeling the weight of the simple gold band in her palm. It was warm from his body heat, smooth from years of being carried close to his heart. "She's gone," Grace said gently. "You're Margaret, your son. They're part of your past, part of what made you who you are. But they're not your future. We could be if you'll let us." Nathaniel took the ring from her hand, studying it for a moment, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Then, with a motion that seemed to cost him considerable effort, he walked to the fireplace and tossed it into the flames. The gold caught the light as it disappeared into the coals, and Grace felt as if something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. The past wasn't erased. It would always be part of them, but it no longer held them prisoner. "Grace," Nathaniel said, turning back to her, "if you'll have me, if you think an old, broken-down soldier could be the kind of father this baby deserves." She silenced him with a kiss. Her first kiss since the terrible mistake with Henry. This kiss was different, gentle but certain, given freely rather than out of obligation or desperation. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing unsteadily. "Yes," Grace whispered against his lips, "yes to all of it." Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, cutting them off from the hostile world beyond their walls. But inside, the cabin, two damaged souls had finally found the courage to reach for something better than mere survival. They had found the possibility of love. The blizzard that trapped them for 3 weeks in December also brought Grace's labor, arriving with the violence and unpredictability that marked everything about their life in the mountains. It started as a backache that wouldn't ease, building slowly through the morning until Grace could no longer pretend it was just the baby, shifting position. "Nathaniel!" she called from where she sat by the fire, her voice tight with pain and fear. "I think it's time." He looked up from the harness he'd been mending, took one look at her face, and set his work aside. "How long since the pains started?" "Since before dawn." "They're getting stronger." Grace gripped the arms of her chair as another contraction rolled through her, stealing her breath. "The baby's not supposed to come for another month." Nathaniel knelt beside her chair, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as they covered hers. "Babies come when they're ready, not when we think they should. We'll manage this, Grace. I've helped birth foals and calves. The principle's much the same." Despite her fear, Grace almost smiled at his matter-of-fact approach. In the months they'd lived together, she'd come to appreciate his ability to reduce any crisis to manageable components. But this felt different from anything they'd faced before. This was life and death, quite literally. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest for weeks. "What if I'm like my mother?" "You're not your mother," Nathaniel said firmly. "You're strong, Grace, stronger than you know, and I'm not going anywhere." The labor progressed through the day with agonizing slowness. Grace walked when she could, rested when she must, and tried to remember the stories she'd heard from the church ladies about birthing. But those stories had been sanitized for unmarried ears, full of euphemisms and careful omissions that left her woefully unprepared for the reality of bringing new life into the world. Nathaniel proved surprisingly knowledgeable about the process, guiding her through each stage with calm efficiency. He'd boiled water, prepared clean cloths, and even managed to find some of Margaret's old nightgowns that would be suitable for the aftermath. His competence should have been reassuring, but Grace found herself wondering how he'd learned so much about childbirth. As evening fell and the contractions grew stronger, Grace's control began to slip. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, waves of agony that left her gasping and shaking. During one particularly fierce contraction, she grabbed Nathaniel's hand and squeezed until her knuckles went white. "I can't do this," she panted when the pain finally eased. "I'm not strong enough." "Yes, you are," Nathaniel replied steadily. "You've already done the hardest part. You've survived everything that brought you to this moment. This baby wants to live, Grace. All you have to do is help it get here." But as the hours passed, it became clear that something was wrong. The baby was coming too early, and Grace was losing blood, too much blood. Nathaniel tried to hide his concern, but Grace could see the worry in his eyes, the way his movements became more urgent. "The baby's not breathing," Nathaniel said quietly. When the child finally arrived, a tiny girl, perfectly formed but frighteningly still, Grace watched in numb horror as he worked over the infant, clearing her airways, rubbing her chest, doing everything he could think of to coax life into the small body. Then, miraculously, the baby coughed. A thin, reedy cry filled the cabin, the most beautiful sound Grace had ever heard. Nathaniel's shoulders sagged with relief as he wrapped the child in a clean cloth and placed her in Grace's arms. "She's so small," Grace whispered, studying the tiny face with its perfect features. The baby couldn't weigh more than 5 pounds, but she was breathing steadily, her little fists waving with determined life. "Small but mighty," Nathaniel agreed. "Like her mother." But Grace's relief was short-lived. The bleeding that had worried Nathaniel during labor wasn't stopping, and Grace could feel her strength ebbing with frightening speed. The world began to dim around the edges, and she found it increasingly difficult to focus on Nathaniel's voice. "Grace, stay with me," he commanded, his usual calm cracking to reveal the desperation beneath. "Don't you dare leave me now, not when we've come this far." Through the haze of weakness and blood loss, Grace tried to tell him about the hidden papers she'd discovered weeks earlier while looking for extra blankets. The bundle of legal documents tucked behind a loose board in the cabin wall. Documents that would change everything if he knew about them. But the words wouldn't come. Her tongue too heavy, her thoughts too scattered, she slipped in and out of consciousness for the next several hours, dimly aware of Nathaniel's hands working to stop the bleeding, his voice alternately commanding and pleading with her to hold on. At some point, she became aware that he was talking to the baby, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Your mama's fighting hard to stay with us, little one," he murmured. "She's the strongest woman I've ever known. Stronger even than she knows. We just have to give her time to remember how to be strong." When Grace finally surfaced fully from the fog of blood loss and exhaustion, pale winter light was filtering through the cabin windows. She was weak, desperately weak, but alive. The baby lay sleeping in the crook of her arm, tiny but breathing steadily. "How long?" she whispered. 2 days, Nathaniel replied, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "You've been drifting in and out. I thought—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Grace studied his face, seeing the toll the crisis had taken on him. His eyes were red-rimmed with sleeplessness, his usually neat beard unkempt. But there was something else in his expression, something that looked almost like wonder. "She looks like you," he said softly, gazing at the baby. "Same determined chin, same way of making her wishes known without saying a word." "Nathaniel," Grace said, remembering the secret she'd been trying to share before the blood loss took her consciousness. "There's something you need to know. Behind the loose board by the window, there are papers." He frowned, clearly confused. "What papers?" "Look and see." With obvious reluctance to leave her side, Nathaniel moved to the wall she'd indicated and began feeling along the boards until he found the loose one. The bundle of documents he pulled out was wrapped in oiled cloth, protected from moisture and age. As he unfolded them, Grace watched his expression change from confusion to disbelief to something approaching shock. "These are mining claims," he said slowly. "Silver claims for the entire mountain range. They're all in my name, but I never—" He stopped, studying the documents more carefully. "These were filed 23 years ago, just after I first came up here." "Keep looking," Grace urged. The next document made Nathaniel go very still. It was a geological survey, complete with detailed maps and mineral assessments. The mountain range where they'd built their life together wasn't just beautiful wilderness. It was sitting on one of the richest silver deposits in the territory. "I don't understand," Nathaniel said, sinking into his chair. "I never filed these claims. I never had this survey done." Grace smiled weakly. "But someone did. Someone who cared about your future even when you'd given up caring about it yourself." The final document in the bundle was a letter yellowed with age and written in a woman's careful script. Nathaniel's hands shook slightly as he unfolded it, and Grace could see him recognizing the handwriting. "It's from Margaret," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He read silently for a moment, then looked up at Grace with tears in his eyes. She filed the claims before she left, hired the survey, made sure everything was legal and proper. She says she knew I'd need something to build a future on, even if that future wasn't with her. Grace felt tears on her own cheeks. She loved you, Nathaniel. Even when she couldn't stay, she loved you enough to give you hope. The implications of the discovery were staggering. The silver alone would make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. But more than that, it meant they had a weapon to fight back against Henry Morrison and his father's attempts to drive them off the land. "We're rich," Nathaniel said wonderingly. "Not just comfortable, truly wealthy. We could buy half the territory, if we wanted to." Grace shifted the baby to her other arm, marveling at how such a tiny person could change everything. "What do we do now?" Nathaniel looked from the documents to Grace to the baby, and slowly a smile began to spread across his weathered face. "Now we fight back. We build the life we want, the way we want to build it. And we make sure this little girl grows up knowing she can be anything she chooses to be." Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the cabin, 3 people who'd been discarded by the world had just discovered they held the power to reshape it entirely. Spring came to the mountains with unusual warmth that year, melting the snow in rushing torrents and filling the air with the promise of new beginnings. Grace stood on the cabin's small porch, little Sarah in her arms, watching Nathaniel load supplies onto their pack mules. After months of isolation, they were finally ready to return to the world, but this time they would return on their own terms. Sarah, now 4 months old, had thrived despite her early arrival. She was still small, but perfectly healthy, with bright eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Grace had fashioned a sling that allowed her to carry the baby while keeping her hands free, and Sarah seemed to enjoy the gentle motion of travel. "You sure about this?" Nathaniel asked, checking the straps on Grace's saddle one final time. "Once we ride into town, there's no taking back what we're about to do." Grace adjusted Sarah's blanket and smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The ride to Copper Ridge took most of the day, partly because they were traveling with a baby, but mostly because they stopped several times to meet with other mountain settlers. Word of their discovery had spread quietly through the remote communities, and the implications were becoming clear to everyone involved. If Nathaniel's claims were legitimate, and the legal documents they'd found suggested they were, then half the businesses in Copper Ridge were operating on his land. Each stop brought new allies to their cause. Jake Henderson, who ran a small trading post in the foothills, had been dealing with Henry Morrison's increasing arrogance for months. Mary Catherine Walsh, the widow who ran the boarding house, had her own grievances against the Morrison family's attempts to control every aspect of town business. Even Dr. Samuel Thorne, the territory's only physician, admitted he'd grown tired of Henry's attempts to dictate moral standards for the entire community. "That boy's been needing someone to take him down a peg for years," Dr. Thorne said bluntly, as he examined Sarah and pronounced her perfectly healthy. "His father's no better, thinks owning the church gives him the right to own everything else too." By the time they reached Copper Ridge's outskirts, Grace felt like they were leading a small army. Not a violent army, but a determined group of people who'd had enough of being told what to think and how to live by the Morrison family and their supporters. The town looked smaller than Grace remembered, shabbier somehow. The mining boom that had built Copper Ridge was long over, and the remaining businesses survived mainly by serving the scattered ranches and mountain communities. It was exactly the kind of place where one family could accumulate disproportionate influence simply by outlasting their competitors. Murphy met them at the edge of town, his weathered face creased with something that might have been amusement. "Word's gotten around that you folks have something interesting to show people," he said. "Henry Morrison's been making noise all morning about how you're trying to stir up trouble." "Are we trying to stir up trouble?" Grace asked innocently. Murphy's grin widened. "Oh, I surely hope so. This town's been boring as hell all winter." They made their first stop at the courthouse, such as it was, a small building that also served as the sheriff's office and the territorial land registry. Sheriff Webb emerged as they approached, his expression carefully neutral. Grace had always thought he was a decent man, caught between his duty and the political realities of a small town. "Miss Holloway," he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Brennan, heard you folks had some excitement over the winter." "You could say that," Nathaniel replied, dismounting and helping Grace down from her horse. Sarah fussed briefly at the change in motion, then settled back into contented sleep. "Sheriff," Grace said, "we need to file some paperwork with the territorial registry, legal documents that might interest quite a few people in town." Webb's eyebrows rose. "What kind of documents?" Instead of answering directly, Nathaniel pulled out the bundle of mining claims and the geological survey, the kind that might explain why certain families have been so interested in driving people off land they don't actually own. Word of their arrival spread through the town with the speed of gossip in a small community. By the time they emerged from the courthouse an hour later, having filed copies of all their documents with the territorial registry, a small crowd had gathered in the street. Grace recognized many of the faces, townspeople she'd known since childhood, church members who'd watched her grow up, business owners who'd witnessed her humiliation at the hands of Henry Morrison. At the back of the crowd, she spotted Henry, himself flanked by his father and several other men Grace didn't recognize. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the way his hand rested near his sidearm. This confrontation had been building for months, and everyone in town knew it. "Folks," Sheriff Webb called out, stepping onto the courthouse steps to address the crowd. "Mr. Brennan here has presented some legal documents that are going to be of considerable interest to this community. Seems like there's been some confusion about land ownership in these parts." A murmur ran through the crowd. Grace felt Nathaniel move closer to her, not protectively but supportively. She appreciated that he didn't try to shield her from what was coming. He understood that this was her fight as much as his. Reverend Morrison pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face set in lines of moral authority. "Sheriff Webb, I don't know what kind of deception is being attempted here, but I won't stand by and watch this town be disrupted by false claims and sinful behavior." "What false claims would those be, Reverend?" Grace called out, her voice carrying clearly in the cool spring air. "The claim that your son abandoned me at the altar. The claim that he ran away rather than face his responsibilities. Or perhaps the false claim that I'm carrying his child." She shifted Sarah in her arms so that the baby was clearly visible to the crowd. Even those who might have believed Henry's lies about the baby's paternity could see the resemblance now. Sarah had inherited her biological father's fair coloring and delicate features. "That child could be anyone's," Henry said loudly, but his voice lacked conviction. "You've been living in sin with that mountain man for months. Who knows what I know," Grace interrupted, "is that this baby was conceived 3 nights before our supposed wedding, when you came to me frightened and desperate, begging for comfort and assurance that you weren't making a mistake." Her voice carried a cutting edge that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. "What I know is that you took what you wanted from me and then ran away when it came time to keep your promises." The crowd was silent now, hanging on. Every word. Grace could feel the weight of their attention, their judgment, their curiosity, but she no longer cared what they thought of her. She had something more valuable than their approval. She had the truth. "Furthermore," she continued, "what I know is that your family has been trying to drive Mr. Brennan and me off land that doesn't belong to you. Land that, as it turns out, is legally owned by the man standing beside me." Nathaniel stepped forward, holding up the mining claims for all to see. "These documents, filed 23 years ago and properly registered with the territorial government, establish clear ownership of this entire mountain range and everything on it. That includes the land under Murphy's Saloon, The trading post, the church, and about half the buildings in this town. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace could see people in the crowd doing rapid mental calculations, realizing the implications of what Nathaniel had just revealed. If his claims were legitimate, then many of the businesses in town had been operating on his property without permission for decades. Henry's face had gone pale, but his father stepped forward, with the commanding presence that had made him the town's moral authority for so long. "These claims are obviously fraudulent," Reverend Morrison declared. "This man disappeared into the mountains 20 years ago. He can't simply reappear with convenient paperwork and expect—" "Reverend Morrison," Dr. Thorne interrupted, moving through the crowd to stand beside Grace and Nathaniel. "I've examined these documents. The signatures are properly notarized, the territorial seals are authentic, and the filing dates are clearly recorded in the official records. Whatever else might be in dispute here, these claims appear to be entirely legitimate." Jake Henderson pushed forward as well, adding his voice to the growing support. "I've been paying rent on my trading post to the Morrison family for 15 years. Turns out I should have been paying it to Nate here. Makes me wonder what other arrangements in this town might need to be reconsidered." Grace watched Henry's expression grow increasingly desperate as he realized how quickly public opinion was shifting. The crowd that had gathered expecting to witness his triumph was instead watching his family's carefully constructed authority crumble. "This is ridiculous," Henry burst out. "You can't seriously be considering the word of a woman who's been living in sin, who's borne a bastard child." The words were barely out of his mouth when Nathaniel moved. Not violently, but with the fluid precision of someone who'd learned to fight in places where hesitation meant death. He didn't strike Henry, didn't even touch him. He simply positioned himself between Henry and Grace with such obvious intent that the younger man stumbled backward. "Boy," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of consequences, "you'd best think very carefully about what you say next. Miss Grace has shown you more patience than you deserve, but mine runs considerably shorter." There was something in Nathaniel's tone, in the way he held himself, that reminded everyone present that he wasn't just a mountain hermit. He was a war veteran, a man who'd survived things that would have broken weaker people. The crowd sensed it, and several people moved instinctively away from the potential confrontation. But Grace had no intention of letting Nathaniel fight her battles for her. She stepped around him, facing Henry directly, with Sarah still cradled in her arms. "You want to talk about legitimacy, Henry," she said, her voice carrying across the silent street. "Let's talk about it. This baby is legitimate because she's wanted, because she's loved, because she has two parents who'll move heaven and earth to protect her. That's more legitimacy than you've ever had, with all your family's money and influence." She turned to address the crowd directly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I know what many of you think of me. I know the stories that have been told, the judgments that have been made, but I also know something else. I know that most of you have seen what real love looks like, and you know it when you see it." Grace moved closer to Nathaniel, close enough that everyone could see the way he instinctively shifted to support her, the way his hand moved protectively toward the baby without him even seeming to realize it. "This man found me with nothing," she continued. "No home, no money, no prospects, no hope. He gave me all of those things, not because he had to, not because society expected it of him, but because he chose to. Because when it mattered, he was the kind of man who stayed instead of running away." The comparison to Henry was implicit but unmistakable. Grace could see it register in the faces around her, could see people beginning to remember exactly how Henry Morrison had behaved when faced with responsibility. "Now," Grace said, her voice taking on a businesslike tone, "we have some practical matters to discuss. Mr. Brennan is the legal owner of most of this town's commercial district. He could evict half of you tomorrow if he chose to, but he's not interested in destroying this community. He's interested in being part of it." Nathaniel nodded, stepping forward to address the crowd. I'm prepared to honor all existing arrangements and leases, provided they're fair to both parties. I'm not looking to get rich off my neighbors, but I am looking to ensure that my family is treated with the respect we deserve." The word family hung in the air, and Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest. He'd claimed them publicly, definitively, in front of the entire town. "You can't be serious," Henry said desperately. "You're going to let them blackmail the entire town. You're going to reward their immoral behavior." "What's immoral about it, exactly?" Mary Catherine Walsh called out from the crowd. "Seems to me like a man taking responsibility for a woman and child that another man abandoned. Seems to me like that's exactly what decent people are supposed to do." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd, and Grace realized that public opinion had shifted decisively in their favor. The people of Copper Ridge had lived through their own hardships, their own struggles with survival and dignity. They recognized authentic commitment when they saw it, and they knew the difference between love and convenience. Sheriff Webb stepped forward again, clearly ready to regain control of the situation. "Folks, it seems like we have some legal and practical matters to sort out here, but that's going to take time and proper consideration. For now, I suggest everyone go about their business while the appropriate parties work out the details." As the crowd began to disperse, Grace felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Dr. Thorne smiling at her with genuine warmth. "Miss Grace," he said, "I'd be honored to baptize your daughter when you're ready. Seems to me like she's got the kind of parents who'll raise her right, regardless of what anyone else might think about the circumstances." Tears pricked Grace's eyes at the unexpected offer of acceptance. "Thank you, Doctor. That means more than you know." As they prepared to leave the courthouse area, Grace caught sight of Henry Morrison standing alone near his father's church. The crowd had abandoned him, his allies had melted away, and he looked like a man who'd finally realized the consequences of his choices. For a moment, Grace felt a flicker of pity for him. Then Sarah made a small sound in her sleep, and Grace remembered all the nights she'd spent, terrified and alone, all the fears about her baby's future, all the strength she'd had to find when Henry's weakness left her with no other choice. The pity faded, replaced by something harder and more lasting, the knowledge that she'd chosen correctly. She'd chosen the man who stayed, the man who fought for what mattered, the man who understood that love was built through actions rather than words. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new attempts to build a life that satisfied both their needs and society's expectations. But tonight, they would return to their mountain cabin as a family, legally and socially recognized, with the power to shape their own destiny. The spring evening was warm as they rode out of town, and Grace could hear nightbirds calling from the pine-covered slopes above them. Sarah slept peacefully in her arms, and Nathaniel rode beside them with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd finally found something worth fighting for. The confrontation Grace had been dreading came 3 days later, just as the morning mist was lifting from the valley. She was hanging laundry behind the cabin, Sarah sleeping peacefully in a basket at her feet, when the sound of multiple horses approaching made her freeze. Henry Morrison rode at the head of a group of 6 men, all armed, all wearing the hard expressions of people who'd come to settle matters once and for all. Behind Henry rode his father, along with 2 men Grace didn't recognize, hired guns by the look of them, brought in from outside the territory to handle what local men might be reluctant to do. Grace's first instinct was to run, to grab Sarah, and flee into the forest where horses couldn't follow. But running would solve nothing, and besides, there was nowhere to go. This was their home, their land, their life. If they were going to lose it, they would lose it fighting. "Nathaniel," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. He emerged from the barn, where he'd been tending the animals, took one look at the approaching riders, and moved with swift efficiency toward the cabin. "Get inside," he said quietly as he passed her. "Take the baby and stay away from the windows." "No." Grace surprised herself with the firmness of her own voice. This started with me. If it's going to end, I need to be part of ending it." Nathaniel paused, his hand on the cabin door. For a moment, Grace thought he was going to argue, to insist on protecting her whether she wanted protection or not. Then he nodded once, a sharp gesture of respect and acceptance. "Your choice," he said, "but stay behind me and be ready to move fast if things go bad." The riders drew up in the cabin's small yard, their horses stamping and snorting in the morning air. Henry dismounted with theatrical swagger, his hand resting prominently on his sidearm. The two strangers remained mounted, their cold eyes scanning the area with professional assessment. "Grace Holloway," Henry called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd convinced himself he was in the right. "I've come to collect what's mine. The child belongs with her father, not with this mountain savage." Grace stepped out from behind Nathaniel, Sarah cradled protectively in her arms. "And what makes you think you're her father, Henry? The DNA you've been denying for months? The responsibility you ran away from? Or just the fact that you've finally realized she might be worth something to you?" One of the strangers leaned forward in his saddle, studying Grace with the calculating gaze of a man who evaluated everything in terms of profit and loss. "Boss says the girl comes with us, willing or not. Makes no difference to me which way it goes." Nathaniel's voice, when he spoke, carried the deadly calm of a professional soldier. "Mister, you'd best think real careful about what you're suggesting. That woman and that baby are under my protection, and I take my responsibilities seriously." The gunman's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Old man, I've killed better soldiers than you for less money than I'm making today. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." For a heartbeat, the mountain clearing was silent except for the whisper of wind through pine branches. Grace could feel the violence building in the air, could sense that they were moments away from bloodshed that would change everything. Then Nathaniel did something unexpected. Instead of reaching for his rifle, instead of preparing for the fight that seemed inevitable, he simply smiled. It was a cold expression, devoid of humor, and it made Grace's blood run cold. "Son," he said quietly, "I spent 4 years killing better men than you for no money at all. The difference is, back then, I was fighting for a cause I wasn't sure I believed in. Today, I'm fighting for something I know is worth dying for." He paused, his winter-colored eyes never leaving the gunman's face. "Question is, are you getting paid enough to die for Henry Morrison's wounded pride?" Grace watched the stranger's confidence flicker for the first time. Whatever he'd expected from the grizzled mountain man, it wasn't the calm certainty of someone who'd already calculated the odds and accepted the potential cost. Reverend Morrison urged his horse forward, trying to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his influence. "This has gone far enough. Grace, child, think of your immortal soul. Think of what's proper and right. Come home with us. Marry my son as you should have months ago, and we can put this unfortunate episode behind us." Grace looked at the man, who'd been her spiritual guide for most of her life, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The righteousness in his eyes wasn't moral conviction. It was pride, wounded and desperate and dangerous. "Reverend Morrison," she said softly, "you taught me that marriage was a sacred covenant, a promise before God and man to love and honor each other. Your son broke that covenant before it was even made. Why would I trust him with it now?" "Because," Henry burst out, his composure finally cracking, "because you belong to me. Because I chose you first. Because without me you're nothing but a mountain man's whore." The words hung in the morning air like a curse, crude and ugly and revealing. Grace felt something inside her snap, some last vestige of the frightened girl, who'd once been grateful for Henry Morrison's attention. "No, Henry," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing with quiet authority. "I belong to myself, and I choose him." Grace's declaration seemed to break something in Henry. His face twisted with rage and humiliation, and his hand moved toward his gun with the jerky motion of someone driven beyond rational thought. But before he could draw, one of the hired gunmen spoke up. "Hold on there, boy. Something you should know before we start shooting up the countryside. The stranger dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. From his saddlebags, he pulled out a rolled document that looked official and expensive. Grace felt her heart sink. Whatever this was, it looked like legal trouble. "Name's Jackson Crane, Territorial Marshal," the man said, his earlier menace, replaced by professional courtesy. "Got some interesting reading material here that changes the nature of this conversation considerably." Henry's face went pale. "What are you talking about? You work for my father. We hired you to—" "You hired me to serve legal papers," Crane corrected smoothly. "Papers that, as it turns out, are based on some seriously flawed assumptions about property ownership and parental rights." He unrolled the document, scanning its contents with apparent satisfaction. "See, territorial law is pretty clear about abandoned children. When a man leaves his pregnant bride at the altar and flees the territory, he forfeits all legal claim to any resulting offspring." Reverend Morrison spurred his horse forward, his face flushed with indignation. "That's preposterous. Henry is the child's natural father. He has rights." "Had rights," Crane corrected. "Past tense. Rights he abandoned when he chose cowardice over responsibility." The marshal's gaze swept over the assembled group with professional assessment. "Furthermore, territorial law recognizes common law marriage after 6 months of cohabitation. Miss Grace here and Mr. Brennan have been living as husband and wife for longer than that." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Are you saying we're legally married? In the eyes of territorial law?" "Yes, ma'am. Have been for months." Crane smiled with what might have been genuine warmth. "Congratulations, Mrs. Brennan." The title hit Grace like a physical blow, not because it was unwelcome, but because it represented something she'd never dared hope for. Legal recognition of the bond she and Nathaniel had built, social acceptance of their unconventional family. Henry's voice cracked as he tried to process this reversal of everything he'd planned. "This is impossible. You can't just— There has to be a ceremony, a minister, witnesses." "Not under territorial law," Crane replied cheerfully. "Common law marriage is recognized and binding. Has been. For years. Surprised a preacher's son wouldn't know that." The second gunman, who'd remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Marshal Crane, what about our contract? The Morrison family paid us good money to serve legal papers that are now invalid," Crane finished. "Contracts, void. You boys are free to ride on out of here with no hard feelings." Grace watched in amazement as Henry's carefully orchestrated confrontation collapsed around him. The hired guns were already mounting their horses, clearly eager to be away from a situation that had suddenly become legally complicated. Even Reverend Morrison seemed to be reconsidering his position, his moral certainty wavering in the face of territorial law. But Henry himself wasn't finished. With the desperate fury of a man watching his last chance for vindication slip away, he lunged toward Grace and the baby, his intentions unclear but obviously hostile. He never reached them. Nathaniel moved with the fluid efficiency of a man who'd spent years surviving violent situations. He didn't draw a weapon, didn't resort to the deadly skills Henry's hired guns had feared. He simply stepped into Henry's path and stopped him with a single, perfectly placed blow to the solar plexus that dropped the younger man to his knees, gasping for air. "Son," Nathaniel said quietly, standing over Henry's doubled-up form, "you've had more chances than you deserved. This is the last one you'll get. Ride away now and we'll call this settled. Stay, and I'll show you exactly what 20 years in. These mountains taught me about dealing with threats to my family." Henry struggled to his feet, his face red with exertion and humiliation. For a moment, Grace thought he might try again, might push the confrontation to its violent conclusion. Then she saw something break in his expression, not just defeat, but recognition that he'd been fighting for something that was never really his to claim. "This isn't over," he said, but the words carried no conviction. "Yes, it is," Grace replied firmly. She stepped forward, Sarah sleeping peacefully in her arms, despite the chaos around her. "It's been over since the moment you chose to run instead of fight for what mattered. Some choices can't be unmade, Henry. This is one of them. Marshal Crane rolled up his documents and prepared to mount his horse. Mrs. Brennan, Mr. Brennan, you'll want to file the proper paperwork in town to make everything official. But legally speaking, you're married, the child is legitimate, and your property rights are secure. He touched his hat brim respectfully. I'll make sure word gets around that this matter is settled. As the group of riders departed, leaving only dust and the memory of violence narrowly averted, Grace found herself standing beside Nathaniel in the sudden quiet of their mountain home. Sarah stirred in her arms, making small, contented sounds, completely unaware that her future had just been secured. "Mrs. Brennan," Nathaniel said softly, testing the sound of her new name. Grace smiled, feeling something settle into place in her chest that she hadn't even realized was still unsettled. "I like the sound of that." They stood together in the morning. Sunlight, a family not just in fact but in law, watching their enemies disappear into the distance and their new life stretch out before them like an uncharted territory full of promise. 6 months later, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Grace stood in the yard of their expanded homestead, watching Nathaniel teach 2-year-old Sarah how to stack firewood. The little girl's attempts were more enthusiastic than effective, but Nathaniel's patience seemed infinite as he guided her small hands and praised her efforts. The changes in their lives had been profound and far-reaching. The silver claims had indeed proven valuable beyond their wildest dreams, but they'd approached their newfound wealth with the same careful deliberation they brought to everything else. Rather than moving to some distant city or abandoning the mountains that had sheltered them, they'd chosen to invest in the community that had finally accepted them. Copper Ridge had transformed along with their fortunes. New businesses had opened, drawn by the promise of steady work in the silver mines that Nathaniel operated with fair wages and safe conditions. The town's population had nearly doubled, bringing fresh energy and opportunity to what had been a dying community. Grace had established a school, housed in a new building that sat on land Nathaniel had donated for the purpose. Teaching the children of miners, ranchers, and mountain settlers had given her a sense of purpose that complemented her roles as wife and mother. The parents, who'd once whispered about her moral character, now brought their children to her classroom with genuine respect, recognizing her intelligence and dedication. The Methodist Church had a new minister now, a young man named Reverend David Carver, who preached about forgiveness and second chances rather than judgment and condemnation. The old Reverend Morrison had left town quietly after Henry's final humiliation, taking with him the rigid moral certainty that had divided the community for so long. Henry himself had disappeared entirely, last seen boarding a train headed for California. Grace occasionally wondered what had become of him, but without bitterness. His weaknesses had nearly destroyed her life, but they'd also led her to something better than anything she could have planned for herself. Dr. Thorne had indeed baptized Sarah in a ceremony that drew half the territory to witness the legitimation of Copper Ridge's most famous unconventional family. The baby had worn a christening gown that Grace had sewn herself, working by lamplight while Nathaniel carved toys and Sarah slept peacefully in her cradle, now watching her husband and daughter. Together in the golden afternoon light, Grace marveled at the unexpected turns that had brought them to this moment. Sarah had Nathaniel's steady temperament and Grace's curious intelligence, but she also possessed a confidence that neither of her parents had known at her age, the confidence of a child who'd never doubted she was wanted and loved. "Mama, look," Sarah called out, pointing to her wobbly stack of wood. "I made it tall." "Very tall," Grace agreed, moving to join them. "Almost as tall as you are." Nathaniel straightened, brushing bark from his hands, and smiled at the sight of his wife and daughter together. The smile transformed his weathered face, erasing years of solitude and pain. Grace had never tired of seeing that expression. The way love had gentled the hard edges that 20 years of isolation had carved into his features. "Got something for you," he said, reaching into his shirt pocket. "Came with today's mail from town." Grace accepted the official-looking envelope with curiosity. The return address bore the seal of the territorial government, and the document inside was written in the formal language of legal proclamations. As she read, her eyes widened with surprise and delight. "They're naming a town after you," she said, looking up at Nathaniel with amazement. "The new mining settlement in the northern claims. They want to call it Brennanville." Nathaniel shook his head with amusement. "Fool notion. What would I want with a town named after me?" "It's an honor," Grace insisted. "Recognition of what you've built here, what you've given to this community." "What we've built," he corrected gently. "None of this would have happened without you. Grace, you're the one who taught me that hiding in the mountains wasn't the same as living." Sarah, bored with the conversation, wandered off to chase a butterfly through the garden Grace had planted behind the house. They watched her go, both of them marveling at her fearless exploration of the world around her. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked quietly. "Giving up the solitude, taking on all the complications that come with family and community?" Nathaniel considered the question seriously, as he always did when Grace asked him something that mattered. "I regret wasting 20 years being afraid of exactly this," he said finally. "I regret not knowing sooner that love isn't something that gets used up when you spend it on the wrong person. It's something that grows stronger when you find the right person to share it with." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at his simple honesty. Even after all this time, Nathaniel could surprise her with the depth of emotion he kept hidden beneath his practical exterior. "I'm pregnant again," she said softly, the words coming out before she'd consciously decided to share the news. Nathaniel went very still, his eyes searching her face. "You're sure?" Dr. Thorne confirmed it this morning, due in the spring. Grace smiled at his expression of wonder and joy. "I thought you should know before the whole town starts speculating about why I've been green around the gills lately." Nathaniel pulled her into his arms, holding her with the careful strength of a man who'd learned to treasure what he'd been given. "Another chance," he murmured against her hair. "Another blessing I never thought I'd be lucky enough to receive." As the autumn evening settled over their mountain home, Grace reflected on the strange arithmetic of loss and redemption. She'd lost everything she'd thought she wanted: the conventional marriage, the social respectability, the safe predictability of a preacher's wife's existence. In return, she'd found something she hadn't even known existed: a love built on mutual respect and shared struggle, a partnership that made both of them stronger than they could ever be alone. The sun set behind the peaks in a blaze of color that painted the sky in shades of promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to build on the foundation they'd created together. But tonight, as they gathered their daughter and went inside to the warmth of their home, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she'd chosen correctly. Sometimes the best destinations were the ones you never planned to reach.